Just checking your clock. Oh, no, you cannot take any pictures of me while I talk because I'm neurologically challenged and I'll forget everything. Just sit down, relax. Okay. What I'm going to do in the next half an hour, I think, is talk to you about my experience of leading an organization in a very challenging environment. I started Kids Company 16 years ago, and my intention had been to take care of some children who were aged under 11, about whom we were worried because the holidays were coming about, and a lot of these children had very dangerous parents who were themselves very disturbed, and they were not providing the kids with food, protection. So we thought we'd look after these children during the holidays when school is closed and return them back to school. And we were a couple of therapists, and we took over 2 railway arches in Camberwell, very chirpy, decorated them all, put toys and art materials in them, and thought, here we go, let's have these kids in. But what actually happened to us is that within a period of a few weeks, we ended up initially with 100 adolescent boys from the local gangs who turned up in hordes, and there was a sort of metal gate there with a cobbled pathway coming up to the arches, and these boys at 3 o'clock used to pour into the place, get out their knives, rip the furniture, set the cushions alight, roll their spliffs and kind of look us up and down like we were idiots. And I was actually out of my depth, didn't understand a word they said. I didn't understand bad meant good and bling was gold. I didn't understand the street language. And I was totally terrified, not knowing what to do. And I was left with a very stark choice, which is, do I turn these boys away, in which case, what was I going to do? Stand at the gate and say, don't come in, and they were just going to roll over me? Or did I go with them? And if I went with them, I didn't have the money, I didn't have the staff, I didn't know why they were the way they were, why were they sort of committing so much crime, and why were they so violent? And before we could take breath, we ended up with another 200 kids who were predominantly children of drug addicts. So within months, we had 400 kids on that premises, some of them very young Oliver Twist lookalikes, scavenging in bins for food and shoplifting, and then these really tall, so very aggressive boys who were surviving through the criminal network and drug dealing. And I, as an individual leading this staff team, had to think what to do about it. So that was the first test of leadership, in a way, for me, which was I going to give up, or was I going to stay with it? And I think one of the important things about leadership that people often don't talk about is its spiritual dimension. And by that I don't mean religious. It's not about religion. It's about having kind of principles that are beyond your day-to-day values. Because we go through our lives being told that we've got to go to a particular school, get a particular job, dress a particular way, be at a particular party, and all the time, without realizing it, people are forced into a position as a human being of acquiring credit rating. And people do it in different ways. So you get a higher credit rating as an individual if you've been to a particular public school, or you're carrying a handbag with a certain label, or you're wearing clothes a certain way. And in this way, what's happened without people realizing it is that human beings have become commodities, and they are so diminished in personal values, and often are forced into the position of being almost like objects. And the better you are in the objects you associate with and the objects you carry, you're supposed to have the greatest power. And this happens amongst the wealthy and the middle classes. And, you know, parents can force their children into behaving that way, often even because the parent themselves wants to be elevated. My child went to this music school, my child went to this university, and so on. At street level, with the kids I worked with, the same pattern was evident, but this time at street level it was about how violent you were capable of being. The more violent you were, the more your credit rating was up. And in fact, credit rating is actually about survival. People, if you dig it and you peel away the layers and you ask yourself the question, why is it so important for me to be seen to be that important? Fundamentally, it boils down to survival, because the more important an individual is seen to be, it is more likely that the group will choose them. And because of that, people are often driven to enhance their sense of importance so that they can ensure that they're not rejected or excluded from the group. And this is a very interesting paradox when you become a leader, because you've got a situation where you've got to embody a certain amount of capacity and power so that people can perceive you as a leader, but you have to balance that out with the tension of not being so weak as to be too preoccupied with your own credit rating. I always akin it to being slightly kamikaze. You've got to be able to get rid of yourself to have the power to be powerful. And what I mean by that is that leadership is a tightrope, where you stand, on the one hand, you've got to have enough of an ego, enough of a sense of self to be able to make decisions, to mobilize the group and so on, but also enough courage to understand that actually fundamentally you're quite insignificant. You're not that important, and the minute as a leader you become preoccupied about what you represent and what you look like, you become very, very weak. And for me, working as a leader in a way, in a setting that I didn't understand, was very complex, because I ended up with a staff team who in fact hated the children who were walking in through the doors because the children persecuted them so much. And I also ended up with a staff team, when you were kind to these children, who resented it because they felt that these children needed to be punished. And I remember distinctly when people say, where is your biggest test of leadership? It was when I interviewed these 400 children and young people that I realized actually I couldn't find a single kid amongst them who hadn't been prolifically sexually and or physically abused from the time that they were toddlers. And I suddenly understood, when you get kids who are that aggressive and that violating and that menacing, that someone has done that stuff to them for them to be presenting it to you in that way. So it was the first thing that I had to learn, which is in being so de-skilled and not knowing what this client group was, what this group of children were, I had to exercise curiosity. And curiosity, I think, is the #1 requirement of leadership, because leaders have to have enough knowledge to lead and enough vacuum of knowledge to learn. And it's very important to understand that as a leader, you are not the source of knowledge. You are the source of organizing knowledge, and the knowledge is held within the community that you lead or you wish to lead. And it was in listening to these children that I suddenly realized the primary challenge facing all of us, which was that the kids kept telling me, Camilla, I can't effing calm down. I can't calm down. Can't sit down and calm down. And they also explained, a lot of them, that when they got into a fight and really beat up someone, or they were beaten up, that actually they felt soothed and calm. And I, as an individual, I had two choices. I could either say, well, you should calm down and stop fighting, or I had to show curiosity and think, well, I need to find out what's happening to these kids, that they've got into this kind of state. And that's when I realized that actually they were universally, peculiarly similar, these kids that looked to the outside world so random and bizarre. And I decided to send a researcher into the library to find me 500 clinical papers on the brain. I wasn't a scientist. In fact, I failed my biology with a U at GCSE. So I started reading these clinical papers and then realized, oh my God, if these scientists had got together and worked collaboratively, they would have understood why these children were so high risk in their behaviors. So I went to the British Medical Society and said to them that I think we need to think about these children differently. We need to understand that the amount of violence that they're exposed to constantly at the hands of their carers, on the streets when they're being shot at, 1 in 5 of the children at Kids Company are shot at or stabbed, and that is their normal everyday life. 1 in 4 of their parents and immediate families are shot at and stabbed. 1/3 of the kids don't even have a bed to sleep on. 84% of them arrive at our street-level centres homeless. So these are some of the most disadvantaged kids, but they're also some of the most vilified kids. The nation hates them. And I, as a leader, was placed within a challenge, well, how do you raise money to help a group of kids that are universally despised by the country, and all people want for them is some kind of a revenge? And you don't have a beautiful looking, charming, smiley, golden child looking at you, pulling at your heartstrings. You've got a rageful, angry, despising kid who looks at you and wants you dead. And how are you going to raise money for that kind of kid and support that kind of child? So when I got the scientists together, I said to them, look, I think we've got it all wrong. We are trying to punish these kids, and we think that their brains are so organized that they're going to remember the punishment we deliver, and then the next time they're going to come and do something bad, they're going to have a calm enough brain, an organized enough brain to remember what that punishment felt like, use that memory to stop themselves from doing the next bad thing. And I actually don't think these kids' brains work like that. So I asked the scientists to get together and look at these children with an open mind, to think about them not in terms of irrational creatures who are simply antisocial, but to assume some intelligence in their behavior and show some curiosity towards it. And what happened is we ended up with Oxford, Cambridge, UCL, the Institute of Psychiatry, and some of the best universities in the States, and we created this umbrella program called Peace of Mind to actually get the scientists to look at these kids and meet these kids. And they started by interviewing the children, getting to know them. They actually scanned the children's brains, looked at how the neuronal pathways were working. They measured the stress levels of the children, and so on. And what came back was that actually these children had developed brain pathways that were exactly the same as those soldiers who'd gone to war and experienced post-traumatic stress disorder. but that the soldiers were recognized as individuals who needed our support and our compassion, and the difficulties they were experiencing had a name, which is a sort of combat trauma. But the children who were at street level, whose lives people didn't get close to, didn't have a name for the difficulties they presented with other than evil or antisocial. But in fact, the amount of violence that they'd been exposed to was as impactful as the ones that is in a war field, except that a child is experiencing it in their homes and on their estates, and the brain changes had been parallel to that of traumatized soldiers. When I understood this, and I had a hunch that this was the issue, I understood that the task of leadership I had within the organization was to create a community where these children could be reparented using the staff and the community itself, where the missing element of a nurturing, caring parent could be introduced back into their lives, and they could be given a sense of safety, a sense of plenty, a sense of having a future, a sense of possibilities, a sense of doors opening for them. Because if your parent is a chronic and out of control drug addict, or an alcoholic, or simply extremely dangerous, then you don't get access to care. There's no one to go to your parents' meetings, there's no one to feed you, there's no one to take you to a university and show you what university can look like, there's no one to iron your clothes, there's no one to give you pocket money, there's no one to give you travel, and so on. So in every aspect of their lives, these kids were disadvantaged and had doors slammed in their faces because of the fact that they didn't have a functioning parent. And I knew that we had to become that substitute reparenting opportunity. So we ended up creating a community where children hear about us on the streets, they make their way to the kids' company premises, and then there we have the doctor, the nurse, the psychiatrist, the artist, the musician, the teacher, and the children are looked after at the centers, and the centers are open 7 days a week till 10 o'clock at night, so the kids have a secure base. And for those who don't have anywhere to live, we find them somewhere to live. And that community had to be developed over a period of time with the challenges of staff having to learn a different model of dealing with these kids. And this is the model that I want to kind of share with you, because I think it's very applicable when you're managing yourselves. The model that we ended up with is one of regulating yourself. What I mean by that is that you have the front part of your brain, the prefrontal cortex, that is your executive function, you making decisions, you having empathy, you planning, you being able to delay gratification, and also you using the front part of your brain to calm down the emotional centers of your brain, the limbic system. Children who have trauma, or individuals who get stressed, and that will be you on your travels as leaders, when you get stressed, the emotional parts of your brain literally fire and generate tension at brain level and at a physiological level. If you've got enough discipline and you've had enough loving care and the ability to calm yourself down, you will use the front part of your brain to control and modify your emotional responses. And in that way, you're constantly regulating yourself. Because as some of you are sitting there thinking, what the hell is this woman chatting about, coming from the emotional centers of your brain? Why doesn't she shut up, coming from the emotional of your brain? The front part of your brain comes along and says, hang on a second, we're at a leadership training, we've got to endure this one for a while. And you modify it. But what happens to children who've had very poor quality care is that literally the front part of the brain doesn't develop robustly enough, because your neuronal pathways are built up as a result of the interaction that you're at the receiving end of. And we've discovered this when the Romanian orphans were found in their cots, slamming their heads against the metal, pulling their hairs, scratching their faces, biting themselves. And people thought, why are these toddlers doing this to themselves? Because actually, they haven't been sexually or physically abused. And when the scientists scanned their brains, they found big black holes in the front part of these children's brains because they'd been lack of neuronal development as a result of lack of interaction. So what happens is normal people who've had good quality care use the front to calm themselves down within the emotional centers of the brain, but people who've had a lot of trauma in their lives are overdriven from the emotional parts of their brain because of the amount of fright hormone that their brain has been exposed to, and it dysregulates the limbic system, the emotional centers of the brain. So as a leader, your primary job is to regulate often the group. And that means trying to do a number of things. One is address the challenges and the difficulties that the individual is having in front of you on an individual basis so that you're regulating their emotional responses, but also to regulate the group, to organize the group. And literally, your brain capacity has the capacity to synchronize and organize the group mind. And that, in effect, is what charisma is. Charisma is actually someone who has an incredible capacity to gather the group into a central focus and a central set of interests. And we now know, because brain science has advanced so much, that leaders have this capacity, and they acquire this capacity on two levels. One is that you've got to be emotionally in tune. It's no good just having principles and sort of policies. You have to be emotionally in tune. So you have to understand the emotional makeup of the individuals in your group, their needs, and all the time preserve their dignity and make sure that your workers within your group don't end up in a position of humiliation and defense. Because when group members end up in a position of being humiliated and feeling that they need to defend their position, what happens is very primitive behaviors come out, and they actually endeavor to go from the underdog that they experience themselves as, the victim of the group, to being the top dog, because they need to regain a position of power. And they often do it by sabotaging what the group intends to have done and by being very destructive. So it's imperative that you keep an eye on the dignity and sense of safety of the individuals that you're leading. But at the same time, you need to have a very powerful, cohesive vision that isn't just about dragging a number of individuals behind you as individuals, but getting these individuals to collectively work to a vision. And that's why having a very clear vision that turns all your individuals into mini leaders alongside you is the most powerful momentum that you can create. And to do that, you've got to understand that you've got to be one of the foot soldiers, because if you elevate yourself above the rest, what happens is you turn the other workers into obedient characters, and you don't use the collective intelligence of the group. So the art of leadership is to have the vision and to have the capacity to carry the group, but to be simultaneously a foot soldier, so that the group feels that they are all engaged in a kind of heroic task to get this job done, and that the task belongs to all of them, and that all of them are going to be perceived as winners as opposed to you. So it's back to that thing of being number one and being zero at the same time that makes for a powerful leadership position. Finally, I want to talk to you about transference. When you're a leader and you're a kind of number one character, people have a transference to you. That means that they see you in terms of key relationships in their own lives. So they see you like they saw their mum, they see you like they saw their dad, and sometimes they project on you that key relationship that they've had with their mum and dad, the key significant carers. If their relationship with their mum or their dad was a really negative one, as you go through your task and you inhabit the position of power like a parent does, it is possible for the person who works with you to put onto you the negative relationships that they've had with their carers. And you suddenly think, well, I wasn't rude to this guy, but he's being really rude to me. I don't understand. So sometimes as a leader, you need to get close enough to people to untangle the transference they've had onto you and remind them that you are not their drunk dad and you're not commanding them, but that you are a partner in a task that you've all collectively agreed to share. So I think I have to stop. Is that right? Yes, because I think they're going to ask some questions. You took a photograph. All right. So in conclusion, leadership is about humility. It's about understanding that actually you're pretty insignificant, and you need to really know that about yourself. You're not a big deal. And because you're not a big deal, you are just as capable as the Prime Minister of this country to do something important and big, because he too is not a big deal. You strip away his position, he is the same human being as you, I, or anybody else. So real leadership is not about the person, it's about the courage of an individual to be beyond their personhood, but to be sufficiently an individual to be able to plan, implement, problem solve, and respond to situations and have a vision, but at the same time not be preoccupied about the I in the individual, but in the deed that the individual can deliver. And finally, people think aggression, punitive, kind of commanding strategies are the most powerful in engaging individuals and getting them to follow you. In fact, kindness is probably the most potent strategy you have, because everyone can survive violence in one way or another through defensive mechanisms, but very few people will turn their backs on kindness. So I recommend that you consider, as you move forward as leaders, the possibility of you not being that important, but you having an important job to do, and you having to do it by turning everyone around you into similar heroes as you are going to be, and generating an agenda of kindness whilst being lethal about the delivery of the task. You need to be lethal, because you can't fluff around and you can't have intrusions into the path that you set yourself. But the lethalness is not about being cruel to another human being. The lethalness is about tidying up agendas that clutter the pathway and get in the way of the dream. So that is kind of, and finally, one last thing. Don't take yourself that seriously. Any minute you'll be debunked. So it's part of the course of being a leader. In fact, when you choose the position of leadership, you've got to understand that what will follow your height is absolutely your fall, and you need to face the bottom of the pit before you get to have the guts to go to the top. Thank you very much.